Well, it's good to be with you all this morning. I'd like to thank Alan and Mark and Frank for the invitation. And, as an advocate for theological love and reconciliation, it's my contention that we are all brothers and sisters. So I come from the Christian Church Disciples of Christ tradition, but I also study at a Methodist school of theology. So we're amongst family this morning, and we get to have a fun conversation in a tumultuous time, I think. And so this morning, we all probably sense that there is some disruption and things are changing and evolving, and many of us are carrying questions about what we can do as members of the church, the Big C Church, to weather this. We're going to get a little nerdy, if that's okay, if you'll jump into that with me. I'm going to tell a story about a unicorn, and then we're going to look at the history of the past 400 years of philosophical development in the global West. And then we're going to talk about how the church can engage some of these changes and respond to the challenges that are facing us. So are you willing to jump into that with me today? Can we do that? All right. It's going to be fun. We're going to go all over the place. So. All right, I want to start off by talking about this idea that church historian Phyllis Tickle brought up in a book called The Great Emergence. And it's this, that basically every 500 years throughout the church's history, there has been a groundbreaking paradigm shift. Things have changed dramatically. And this is how she frames it. She says, there's the resurrection, sometime in the first century, which was a catalyzing component, obviously, in our history. Then about the 4th or 5th century, you have Constantine grabbing the Christian religion and making it a part of the empire, which is a huge shift from the Galilean vision of Jesus. Then you have, in the 11th century, this thing called the Great Schism, where the church separated in one of the largest ways that it ever has. And then in the 16th century, many of you are probably familiar with the Reformation. So you have this huge split between the Catholics and the Protestants. And now we sit about 500 years from the Reformation. So there is something that is afoot. There's something that is changing. And it's no surprise that it feels kind of earth-shattering. It feels large. And so the questions about what is actually emerging or what we can do about it are the ones that we're all carrying. And so we're going to try to name some things today about what has happened in our past that can give us hopefully some vision for the future. But yeah, something is happening. And so if we can participate in it fully, it's going to help us to weather it well. Okay, so I want to tell you a story on that about a unicorn. And I had this experience probably about 5 or 6 years ago where I think I tweeted something about hell. And it was kind of non-threatening, I thought. It was just something about how it can be, the doctrine of it can be used to kind of like push people out or something like that. And a friend of mine caught wind of it, decided to show up at my house with his Bible. So he comes over, and he's toting his Bible under his arm, and we start to have this conversation. Probably went on for about 2 or 3 hours, and we got to a point where I was trying to help him rethink what he understood hell to be. So I quoted the Greek in the New Testament instead of the actual translation of the Bible. And I said, in the Greek it says this, and it's probably more, this other idea. And he said to me, well, in the King James Bible, it says this word for hell. And I was like, well, the King James Bible also says that there were unicorns in the Psalms. What kind of point are you trying to make? And he goes, well, unicorns could have existed. And I thought to myself, what am I dealing with here? Like, that he had so backed himself into a corner rhetorically that the only thing he could say was that unicorns existed. Now, I use that story to kind of illustrate our times, in a way. We live in a time of fake news, right? We live in a time where things that seem to be real are not, right? And it gets really confusing really, really fast. So the question of how did we get here to these alternative facts and fake truths, actually there was a study I think in Time that came out this week that basically said that atheists now are more likely in this country to vote for a candidate based on their morals than white evangelicals. Okay? That's a flip. There's a huge turnaround. And we're dealing with these questions about what's reality and what's not reality. And so in some spaces within Christianity, uncritical reflection, or not using your critical thinking mind, is actually championed. It's actually something that's a part of the ethos of the community. And so there's a quote by one of my favorite scholars. Her name is Dr. Sandra Lubarsky, and she says this about our day and age. In a deeply dug grave, somewhere in this unremarkable landscape, nature and beauty lie interned together, victims of the mechanism and materialism that define modern science and philosophy. And I would add to that comment that both God and religion lie in that grave as well in our society. I don't mean that literally, I mean culturally. That we are in a place now where we have moved beyond the discourse about God. And so our reflection today is going to be one part philosophy of religion, a little bit of science, a little bit of history, kind of an educational component, and one part, what the hell happened, right? We are in a weird place. And so I want to start here. There's a philosopher named Descartes, and he basically gave us a vision of reality that said this. Objective reality, meaning what is actually real in the world, is thought of as a landscape of bare facts that are fully describable in terms of their physical characteristics. So any value that might be attributed to these bare facts is not intrinsic to the fact itself, but is an embellishment of the fact by the individual experiencing it. So let me make that simple for you. Basically, reality is a bunch of matter bumping up against each other, and any sort of value that we give to reality, meaning like the natural world or our world, our experience of reality, is just like a mental laminate that we put on it. It's not really real. Like nothing's really valuable in reality. It's just matter bumping up against matter. Okay? And so what this does is it pushes like values to the margins. And it basically says that beauty, and I'm sure you've heard this before, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Have you heard that phrase before? Yeah? Okay. What that means is that there's not really any intrinsic beauty in nature. It means that it's something that we ascribe to things we like or we think are pretty, right? So that painting over there, that's beautiful because I like it. It's not really actually beautiful. Somebody could disagree and be like, no, that's ugly, right? So that's what that kind of philosophy put forth, in a sense. And then comes along a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who radically extends this approach. Because in Descartes' vision of the world, the human is the one who organizes the world and gives it value or doesn't give it value, right? There's nothing intrinsic. So that's called anthropocentrism, meaning anthropology, the study of humans, puts humans at the center of the world, of the universe, right? And so Kant extends this idea and says we can't know the world in and of itself at all. We can only know it as ordered by our minds. And the human subject is then, like I mentioned, the source of rational order in the world. So anything that is ordered or valuable, the humans are the source of it, okay? Now, these are kind of, again, nerdy philosophical statements that most people don't ever notice are functioning, but what I want to say to you this morning is that they radically affect everything that happens in our world. So whether or not you might have been aware that these two philosophers in history made these ideas popular or not, our world is an inheritance of the world that they created. So, what has happened to truth in this kind of a world? It has been phenomenologized, or what is the word? Phenomenologized. That's what it is. It's a hard word to say. We're going to get to a lot of ologies and isms today. But so what that means when phenomenology is the popular approach to talking about truth, it completely eradicates the notion that there is any kind of real truth. It only provides us with an idea that truth is a phenomenon that is birthed within our minds as we experience the world. So what has happened to the beautiful on top of that? It is no longer objective in nature. Nature is not actually beautiful. It's in the eye of the beholder. But if you think nature is beautiful, then you can say it is for yourself. You just don't get to tell anybody else that that's the way it is. So what has happened to the good is that we have an era of moral relativism, which is a result of an overemphasis on individualism, right? If the individual human is the center of reality, then whatever they feel is morally true to them is what is actually morally true. And they can't tell anyone else what is morally right or wrong. So what has happened to God and religion? Well, in this system where it's just matter bumping up against matter, there's actually no room for real, what is called causality, which basically means that there's no such thing as divine action, okay? There's no way that God could have set anything in motion. There's no way that God has a role to play in metaphysics at all. And so what we have is a world in which there's not only no God, but there's no divine action in the world either. What has happened to nature? It's become a barren wasteland in actuality. Like scientists, philosophers, since this inheritance have basically rendered the world meaningless in that sense. And so what has happened out of this philosophy is a movement called existentialism, which some of you have probably heard before, I'm imagining. And what existentialist philosophy continued on was this overemphasis on the human subject or the human individual as the center of the world. It's no wonder that we've resulted in something like selfie culture out of this, right? It's all about me, snap, 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 share, share. And anthropocentrism, right? That we humans are hoarding the resources and in turn killing the planet. Okay? So this is all directly tied to these ideas that became popularized and affected our world. And this is our Enlightenment and modern truth inheritance. This is the world that we are situated in today. So God is actually gone from the discourse of any secular university, including UCSB, right? Some of the private Christian institutions obviously still carry these ideas forward. But for the most part, state schools, anything, God is no longer a part of the discourse really, especially in the study of philosophy of religion, which is interesting. And so is it any wonder that we who are a part of religion in some way, whether it's a community or something, are in the situation that we're in? The main export of this line of thinking that we've inherited is called postmodern meaninglessness. Okay, it's the experience that people in the postmodern world have of not having any meaning, not for themselves or for the world around them. It's purposelessness, it's nihilism, it's this ideas. And whether or not those are actually true about the world, it's something that people in the postmodern world are experiencing. So it's important for us to name that. And we see it in culture all over the place. A great place to begin looking to see these ideas is in literature. Is anybody familiar with an author named David Foster Wallace here? Okay, there's a book called Infinite Jest that came out. It's kind of his magnum opus, but it's this idea that there is a sublime bliss in nihilism, that you can actually find peace when you realize the world is meaningless. Okay, that's his idea. Also, even maybe more of you are familiar with Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Yeah, you heard? Okay, no one's ever heard of that. Okay. Well, this idea plays itself out in some ways there also, in the sense that we see that there's a nihilism to chasing the white whale. So alongside these cultural phenomena, we see rising statistics in depression and suicide and people leaving churches in droves. And if we look at the history, we just shouldn't be surprised by this at all, because this is the world we've been given. There's actually, are any of you familiar with an artist named Father John Misty? Yeah, he's a singer-songwriter? Okay. My encouragement would be to go home at some point, put on his newest record. It's called Pure Comedy. It's basically like a postmodern gospel. But I'm talking about like old-fashioned sit down and spin the vinyl and listen to the whole thing all the way through and pay attention to every word. Because what that is just a snapshot. I mean, it literally came out a couple of weeks ago. But it's a snapshot of what it's like to try to make meaning in a meaningless world. And the conclusions, I'll let you listen to it if you want. Again, Father John Misty, Pure Comedy. Just go sit down and spin that record. You will get a sense for what I'm talking about. So, the result is that meaninglessness came about not because nature had been nature and humanity had been given a certain kind of status, but because when Darwin came on the scene and overcame the division between the human mind organizing nature and nature itself. Basically, Darwin came and showed us that we are an evolved species that are just a part of nature. So when we got thrown back into the landscape of nature, it had already been rendered meaningless by Descartes and Kant. And so we now see ourselves as a part of the natural world, But what we're left with now is a barren wasteland devoid of intrinsic value, and that means that we too are intrinsically not valuable, if that makes sense. That's at least the experience of what we know today. And so, I think meaninglessness crept in because as humans, we realized that our true nature is a part of nature. When we realized that, the shock was just too much to handle. And so what we returned to was indeed a meaningless experience. So here's my contention, to kind of summarize all of that philosophy and nerdiness. Meaninglessness is the rub of not being able to live up to the Enlightenment's expectations and the ones that they've placed on modern truth. So if you have a modern truth and you understand the world where matter's bumping up against matter, it's a closed system. It's basically like, this is just the way things are, there's nothing outside of it, and that if you want to characterize the Enlightenment or modernism as a whole, it's that you can know objective reality vis-a-vis science, and it's something that is discoverable. But when we discover the phenomena of like human consciousness, we can't really say that that's something we can know. It's only something that comes on top of it. And so the problem with meaninglessness in that world is that we are told that we know these things for sure, but our experience doesn't line up with that. And so we have this tension that we sit in where we sometimes experience the world as beautiful and true and good and valuable. And yet everything we're taught says, not really. I mean, that's cute, you know? It's cute that you think that, but it's not really that way. And so, okay, the other shit that's happening then is if you think about this idea where we can't actually know what's true anymore, and then you partner that with technology, we have quite a situation on our hands. And so think about something like, if you were told this is the truth, like, okay, maybe let's make a claim like Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, we go John 14:6 if I want. And you try to do something like street evangelism, right? And you're out there in the corner and you're like, hey, I just wanted to tell you that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and if you just believe in him, you can have everlasting life. They'll just Google it. You know what I mean? It's no longer a day and age where like that is something you can pull off. You know what I mean? Because truth is relative, and there's enough information and access literally in your pocket that you could just like look that up and be like, no, that's kind of a construction of early first century Judaism and Hellenistic influence and blah blah blah, right? So we're like, oh no, that was like our thing, you know what I mean? Like we were trying to convert people, and it's not so easy. And so it's within this system, right, that we've been handed with its modern expectations that atheism also emerged, right? If we have all the information at our fingertips, if we know the reality to be a certain way, then like we don't really need God anymore. So there's a few philosophers, Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, but Feuerbach and Marx, neither of them thought that atheism put an end to meaning, right? It's kind of that meaning of nihilism, that meaning of meaninglessness. And Nietzsche actually is the first one to understand that in the West there is a deep connection between God and meaning. And that once you throw God out of the equation, he's famous for saying God is dead, so we have to kill God, right? Once you throw God out of the equation, you throw out meaning altogether. So they knew this. They knew this very deeply. And one philosopher has commented that now cacophony has replaced meaning, or chaos. So when we look at the news, I think we see this playing out. The world is no longer harmonious. Maybe you could make an argument that it never really was. But if we see the news, do we feel like it's more of a harmonious thing or more of a cacophonous thing? I would argue that it's cacophonous. There's a philosopher and historian, contemporary one, named Charles Taylor, who calls this new reality in the 21st century the imminent frame. So Charles Taylor has a book that came out called The Secular Age. It's kind of like his magnum opus of life's work, almost chronicling how we got to where we are in a secular society. And one of the things he says is that the new experience for the postmodern person is an imminent frame. So what is part of that frame is that we have inherited a disenchanted self or a demythologized self. meaning the enchantment about the world, that it was like beautiful and spiritual and all these things, is gone. And we have demythologized. We've taken the myth out of our human story in many ways. And sometimes people study myth academically and other things like that, but not as something to tell us what's actually true, oftentimes. And so we've inherited this idea that the immanent frame contains a disenchanted and demythologized self. And this is also what is called a buffered self, meaning it's insular. We protect ourselves from the outside world. So that is what we do oftentimes. And there is a disharmony in our experience of the world. And so if we experience the world as meaningful, as in the birth of a child, I've got 2 little boys, and I've found that to be a very deeply meaningful experience. Or if we enjoy a sunset, right? Or if we're moved by a symphony, if we're in a deep and intimate relationship with another human being, and we sense on some very visceral level that that's meaningful, when our experiences of those meanings coincide with an educational system that insists our experience of meaning is a mental laminate on all of those experiences, we have a profound disharmony in our lived experience. So let me just recap where we've come from and then connect all of the history with the philosophy of religion in America today. So if nature is devoid of value, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and truth and ethics are relativized, and the self is buffered and disenchanted, and individualism has a deep experience of disharmonious meaninglessness, then that's quite a conundrum for us today. Now, the Enlightenment and modern notions of truth were not all bad, okay? Like, we have technological advancement in the world because of these discoveries. So we can't just demonize them all the way down. They've allowed us to make great leaps, and we use rationality in everyday decisions. Like, to get here today, you probably had to know when to turn left, when to turn right? So we have to use our rational minds to do that. So the problem is when we ultimatize rationalism, or our rational decisions. Rational thinking is very important for our civilization's functioning, and I hope that you're using your rational mind right now to try to track what I'm saying. But the problem is that reducing these modern ideas about truth to the truth, or ultimatizing them, has resulted in the aforementioned ideas which created a beast of a culture that we're dealing with. And so we can see why religion, whose claims tend to be more mystical in nature often, right? Not trying to debate the historicity of certain truth claims within our religion or other ones. But on the whole, religion is about being grasped by something transcendent rather than grasping some proposition, like a math equation, right? It's not A plus B equals C, okay? I mean, some people made, again, evangelism in that way. It's just not working anymore. So if that's the case, if it is really more about being grasped by the transcendent or the divine or however you might articulate that, then we have to realize that the world doesn't necessarily believe in that way anymore. And so we have to reflect upon what this does to our gospel. And so people are leaving churches because we have not really made the transition well, and not really gotten to a place where we have affected change. And so if we want to see our religious future, all we have to do is look at Europe. All of these ideas in philosophy over the past 400 years that I outlined here at the beginning have already played themselves out in Europe, and the effects have trickled down. So if you look at Germany on a Sunday morning, 0.5% of people are in church on a Sunday. 0.5, okay? The crazy thing for those of us who are Christians here in America is that German theological influence is basically our strongest influence, right? So if you look at Bonhoeffer, Barth, Luther, the list goes on. He says, religion not only menaces the goals of postmodernity with its fanaticism, but it also undercuts reason, which comes to be seen as rigorously requiring scientific materialism, basically the matter bumping thing. What emerges from all this is that we can either see the transcendent as a threat, a dangerous temptation, a distraction, or an obstacle to our greatest good. Or we can read it as entering to our deepest craving, need, or fulfillment of the good. So religion can be a means of fanaticism and craziness, or it can also be a means to a healthy, porous openness to something beyond ourselves. Okay, so if that immanent frame is what we're carrying, We can carry that as a buffered self and keep everything out. Or we can have what is called a porous self, where there's an openness to the transcendent, an openness to the divine. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that it also means that we have to learn to hold our truths in a different way. We have to learn to hold them with open hands. And in that way, I think we will have an opportunity to engage this next generation, if we can do that well. Because this whole thing I've laid out for you is what millennials are being raised into. This is their reality. And so whether or not we agree with some of those moves that were made, or whether or not we would like to just, kind of like hunker down and grab onto some past notion, we have to at least meet them where they're at. This is where they are. So when they walk in the door, and I'll add if they walk in the door, right? They need to be engaged in the world that they actually live in with a vision of an even better world. And this means that we need to build trust, okay? So, that being said, there's an idea that actually a Methodist scholar has come up with. His name is Bo Sanders. He's up in Portland. But it's called this idea of Christianism, okay? So I want to contrast that with Christianity. So he basically makes the case that we misstepped in our Western developments over the last 400 years, and that Christianism has disconnected from the faith and tradition that gave it birth. So there's an iteration of Christianity today that's not really what originally Christianity was meant to be as a movement at all. It's this whole different animal, and he calls it Christianism. So he says this: when you see or hear something under the banner of Christian that does not seem to reflect the example of Jesus or the teaching of Christ, you may have wandered into the wilderness of Christianism. It uses all the same words that you know, but in foreign and contradictory ways. It says Christianism is several degrees removed from the teaching and example of Jesus. Now, is anybody tracking this at all? Can you kind of start to apply this to what you see happening in Christianity in America today? Okay. So, that being said, those degrees that are away from the teaching and example of Jesus are named as these. It begins in the formation or formalizing of those things. Then it takes on an authoritarian or hierarchical structure, okay? So the ideas start to separate from the initial Jesus or Christ experience. And then those ideas start to take on like a structure that's usually hierarchical, usually authoritarian in nature. Then, and this is the big one, it gets married to power, okay? This happened in our religion when Constantine took on the religion, like I mentioned at the outset. So now we are 3 degrees from the origin of the Christ event, right? This new orientation becomes solidified and codified as a thing that has its own identity. Christian becomes a category by which you can know who is in and who's out, who is saved and who is lost. And this is the 4th degree of separation from the original event of Jesus of Nazareth embodying Christ, okay? So this is where bad things are done by good people can be justified as being beneficial to the cause or our side. Does that sound familiar at all? Okay. The final stage is when Christian is an identity that helps us to distinguish the in-group from the out-group, not depending on one's obedience to the central tenets of the religion anymore, following the teachings of the founders, or even knowledge of the distinctions that signify identity to the group. So at this point, the signifier or the identity of Christian is no longer anchored to anything that was originally grounded in, and is no longer connected to the very thing that gave it life and health in the beginning. So Christian becomes a floating identity marker and is thus untethered from his proverbial mooring, which is the 5th degree of separation. Now, Bo, who is a friend of mine, again, Methodist scholar, calls this Frankenstein Christianity, right? It's some kind of beast or entity that has really almost no connection to the original movement whatsoever. So as we watch this historical drift, we can see that this is how Sarah Palin can say things like that waterboarding is now how we baptize terrorists. Like she's using Christian imagery, right? And she's applying it to like this horrible, just completely monstrous version of her own ideology, right? And so this one statement really says it all. It says we are the in-group and they are the out-group, okay? So when you add an ism to anything, so he starts to call this Christianism, it's in danger of becoming a Frankenstein creature that takes on a monstrous life of its own. So here's the examples in the U.S. context, okay? Just so you're really catching this image. Democratism. Democratism is when it is no longer about the democracy, but has become about beating the other side. Republicanism is when it's no longer about the republic, but has been reduced to gun ownership with states' rights, right? It's no longer about the republic. Methodism. You ever heard that word? Okay. When members of Methodist churches can no longer tell you what the methods are, right? Then you can tell that Methodism has become more of an identity marker than it has anything else. Evangelicalism. When those who identify as such cannot tell you what the evangelion is, or cannot even articulate the good news. That's what evangelion means, right? Of Jesus' message. Pentecostalism. When the gift of tongues is no longer about proclamation to those who speak in foreign languages, but is about an unknown prayer language that edifies the speaker, right? So these identity markers become things that are floating 5 degrees of separation from the original event itself. And it's not to dismiss or demonize the unique and particular expressions of our faiths. It's to say that sometimes we have quite a beast or a Frankenstein on our hands when we don't really work to embody the core of what was handed down to us in the Christ event. And so, just checking my time. How am I doing on time, Alan?
You good?
Okay, do good. Okay. So Bo's concern, and my concern I shared with him, is that Christian no longer signifies one who follows Christ, and has instead become an ism that designates an us-them distinction that has nothing to do with the teachings or model of Jesus. Wow, I think that's such a powerful statement. We could probably spend our whole day just talking about what it means to be Christian, or what it means to follow Christ, right? But what I want to say in response to all this, we're going to shift gears here and start to talk about our current situation in the church, is that there is hope. I really do think there is hope. I really think there's a voice calling in the wilderness, if you want to use the biblical image, if you will, to make straight the path to beauty, to value, to a world of good, to championing the life-promoting elements in our experience. And here's how we do it, okay? I'm going to try to let you in on this, and I think it'll start some fun conversations today. So Picasso is famous for saying this about tradition. There's 2 ways to honor tradition. You can wear your grandfather's hat, or you can have grandchildren, okay? You think about our current churches, you think about the ways that they try to enforce the upcoming generations to proverbially wear their grandfather's hat, rather than birth something new into the world, then you start to kind of get the picture of what I'm saying. We have got to empower and equip the generations that are coming up to live their expression of the faith, and not force them to wear the grandfather's hat. There's a Franciscan theologian named Richard Rohr. Anyone familiar with? Okay, he basically says this, that our last experience of God is often the biggest obstacle to the next experience of God. Okay? So if we're always looking back to that experience we had, we can't see the next thing that God is drawing us into, right? And so I think much of our conversations in the Christian religion today are conversations that center around like an orientation that is pointed backwards. We're always looking backwards and not looking to what's to come and what's next. And so I have this idea that we need to be talking more about what is religion after religion, okay? That is, what will we be bound together in? Because religion in the Latin is this word ligare, which literally just means to be bound together. It's like people are not going to stop being bound together. We have to stay connected. We need each other. But the problem is religion, big R, as an institution, as a historical movement, is fading from the landscape of our culture, right? It's going away. So the question is more, what are we going to be bound together in now that that iteration is fading, right? Now that those institutions in the West are disappearing. And so I think that there's a few things that we can emphasize that can help us stay rooted and grounded in those things that are really valuable to us while having conversations about what is to come. So one thing we can emphasize is our connectedness. We have got to stick together. We are far better as disciples and Methodists together than we are pushing each other apart. And so our planet, our potential to imagine good as a species is something that we do together. It's not something we do alone. And I think the tendency toward individualism I already named earlier, right? We've got to subvert that. The second thing is, I think there is good reason philosophically and scientifically to restore beauty and intrinsic value to nature itself, which includes us, like I mentioned. When Darwin put us back in the system, that includes the statement that we are beautiful and we are valuable as well. And so I'm not going to get into the nerdy, cosmology of that, but the point is, we can affirm people's beautiful experience of the world. We get to say yes to that. And its goodness, and that it's valuable as well. And so my hope is that as we start to emphasize our connectedness and affirm our experience of beauty, that we can create communities around these shared values and practices, and that the Spirit of God will be with us in that. So another thing that we have to do, because of the tumult of our times, is also affirm and include suffering and vulnerability in what we're doing to get to resurrection. And a lot of churches don't want to talk about the cross, they just want to talk about the victory, right? That's not going to go well. So we need to include those things in the ethos of our communities. So how can we evolve our models of community to better serve the world that we live in? One way that we are endeavoring into this as a congregation, it's very, very seminal, very ground level right now, is to create a community of shared value and practice. So we're doing something, as I think Alan mentioned earlier, called the Way Collective. And the Way is really an emphasis on a way of being in the world, not a way of believing, right? And so what that is we're trying to embody 5 practices together, which are pretty simple. I call them the 5 C's, but it's connection, contemplation, critical thinking, creativity, and compassionate action, okay? My hope in this hypothesis is basically that people with a faith background can thoroughly find themselves and embody those practices and to Christianize them and make them to be right in line with who they are. My other hope is that people who might identify as spiritual but not religious or secularists can also find themselves in those practices too. And that it could be a bridge builder between the two communities that are continually being pushed apart in our society. So that's one thing that we're doing, is trying to overemphasize on shared values and practices rather than beliefs. It's not that we're dismissive of beliefs or that beliefs don't. It's actually the opposite of trying to say that beliefs don't hold value. It's that our beliefs are thoroughly embedded in that which we practice. So yeah, if your personal beliefs are just thoroughly rooted in your Christian confession of Jesus as the Christ, or if your beliefs are secular humanist and you're like, I just value, this worldview, then those will come out in the way you live your life. And so if we can live our lives together for more connection and contemplation and creating more compassionate action in the world, I'm like, bridge building, let's do this, So that's one way to do it. There's a scholar of really American Christianity named Brian McLaren. His new book is talking about, it's kind of contouring these huge shifts that are happening within Christianity. And one of the things that he says is that we're moving from organized religion to organizing religion, right? So from an institutional version of church to a more grassroots movement version of church. So I think we're seeing this especially in the political sphere after the election, and all of the protests and all of the movements. Many of my friends, myself included, who are clergy, are showing up at these things and just saying yes and blessing the idea that there's this organizing movement that is happening. So that's another idea that you could think about and play with a little bit. Another one is something called Church 2.0. Again, this is my friend Bo, who's a Methodist scholar, who's come up with this idea, but we've been in conversation about it for a long time. It's basically this. In Church 1.0, the only technology or innovation that's employed is to reinforce the model as it stands, or the services as they're prescribed, right? So an analogy would be like, if you had yellow pages, let's just make an electronic version of the yellow pages, right? So it's not really changing the model at all. It's just like, let's get screens in and let's get a band with electric guitars and fog machines and everything. But the model of what we're doing actually never changes at all. It's just like updating, right? It's just updating. In Church 2.0, there's a space that's provided that's truly collaborative, okay? That's what I mean by Church 2.0. It emerges from who is there, and it's not a technique or a gimmick to make it cooler. It's actually a way to be truly communal and to be truly vulnerable, to allow the people who are there to affect what is happening. So in 1.0, certainty is the game, right? We have got to update our technology and do things so that we can keep this same certain thing flowing the way it's always flowed. In 2.0, uncertainty means that minimally we're operating with it in a different register, and maximally that it's in a different language altogether. So it's embracing doubt and complexity, but it's also that idea. I think to illustrate it, you could say that living rooms have gone from squares, where it was like the people were the emphasis of the conversation, to U-shapes with a big TV, right, in the center. And so you have this idea that that this church 2.0 would be a move back to facing one another. Okay, it would be away from like the consumer mindset that I'm just going to take in this entertainment, and it's a move from spectating to contributing, right? From I just attend a worship service to I'm a part of the worship service, or the worship gathering. And so in church 1.0, diversity doesn't often come into play much because it's a consumer mindset. How many of you have heard the phrase church shopping? I'm church shopping, right? Like, is there any more direct correlation to like capitalism than church shopping? I don't think there is, probably. But in the 2.0 community, like I mentioned, there's an inherent vulnerability where the community is actually affected by who's there, changed by who's there, the conversation is transformed by who's there, and who's affecting it. So, I mean, I think that I could just belabor this analogy a million times over, but if you look at our church buildings, you look at our pulpits, how high up they are, you look at, you know what I mean? Like the whole structure was built in a church 1.0 structure, where there's somebody who's ordained and called by God and the expert preaching down to the people, okay? That is not what I mean by church 2.0. So we need to be looking for a different operating system altogether, not just trying to hype up and make cool 1.0, okay? That's another idea that I want you to just toss around in your mind. Another thing we've got to do, and I think it correlates with Church 2.0, is embrace something called intersectionality and radical difference. Okay, intersectionality comes out of more of academia. Maybe it's more of an academic term. But what it means is basically that rather than playing identity politics, right? Who's this or who's that? It's black and white. It's gay and straight. Like, we need to realize that our identities are just made up of these complex facets of who we are that include race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, and that these are confluences of what it means to be human. And so rather than try to create a system of operation where we continue to homogenize everything, continue to make everything the same, we've got to embrace our radical difference and be together. We can no longer create communities where we are playing those games of who's in and who's out, or who's this or who's that. We have got to allow our communities to be vulnerable and affected by those who are radically different than who we are. Okay? That's another characteristic I think that's super important. So, another idea I think that's really helpful, that kind of piggybacks off the Picasso idea about tradition, is that there's a difference between guardians and gardeners. And guardians are usually pretty heavily fear-based, right? Like, they can't take this thing that I'm guarding, so we have to like put our forces up, put our walls up, and make sure that we're protecting it. And I want to apply this idea to the kingdom of God, or I like the kingdom of God a little bit better, the family of God, in the sense that, Jesus' images about the kingdom of God are really gardener-oriented, right? There's plant analogies, there's seed analogies, and what if we thought that our churches, our tradition, our kingdom was not something to be guarded, but something to be planted? Something that included our faithfulness and our stewardship in the world. I just like that idea a lot. So the interesting thing about our tradition is the truth that peace is possible and that grace is free and love is boundless never changes. But the culture, as we've just outlined here, is always changing, always shifting. And this is the culture that we're dealing with. So how are we, the question I want to pose to you today is, how are we adapting to meet the culture where it's at? My friend Bo also has this idea about rewords, and we both have a similar allergy to rewords, like return, reclaim, recycle, right? And many people within religion want to return to an earlier age, right? We got to just get back to the early church, you know what I mean? Which there were churches, actually, not just one. But we got to reclaim that. We got to recycle those ideas. We are much more fond of vowel words that start with vowels, like evolve, innovate, adapt, right? There's a different emphasis when we become a people who are interested in evolution and adaptation and innovation than there is recapitulation, right? And so if we want to avoid, well, I don't even know if I want to say that. I'll just say this. There's a book called Change or Die that came out. Has anybody read that book? Okay, it makes this hypothesis, or actually just says this statistic, that 9 out of 10 people, when they go in for an emergency bypass surgery on their heart, when they are told by their doctor what lifestyle changes need to be made in order to live a healthy existence after that, 9 out of 10 people go back and die of the same complication. So what does that tell you about humanity? We do not change easily. 1 out of 10 people can actually change to make a healthier decision. So if we just name that, and we name the opportunity that's before us to allow ourselves to be more evolving and more adapting and more innovating than reclaiming, I think it will serve us quite well. So another way to say it is, for a people that proclaim the paradigm of death and resurrection, we sure don't like to see things die, right? We're scared to let go. But that's the whole thing. I mean, Jesus talks about that a seed needs to fall into the ground and cease to be a seed in order for new life to come, right? So if we don't learn to allow things to die and to empower this new generation to be, the birthing of something new, then it's not going to go well for us. And I've got bad news for you. Like, the statistics are really staggering. Everything dies. Everyone, 100%. That's the thing. That's the paradigm of life. And so, what's the good news for us? And the question that we said at the outset, how can Christianity stay rooted in its tradition and also adapt with the times? Wow, those are just such deep and powerful questions. I think when I think about liberal Protestant theology, and I'm not trying to again make identity markers in terms of liberal versus conservative or something. It's just part of the mainline inheritance of all the mainline church denominations. We've got to, in our proclamation of the gospel, in our embodiment of the gospel, we have got to address the metaphysical concerns, which are the concerns about reality that we talked about, and the existential concerns, meaning the emphasis on human experience and the experience of meaningless. My friend who has a podcast called Homebrewed Christianity, I just finished editing his dissertation, which was on this topic of a liberal Protestant Christology. But the point is that if we, in our articulation and our embodiment of the faith, if we cannot get to a place where what we are saying and what we are living addresses the actual world that we live in today, it's going to be more and more irrelevant. It already has become irrelevant, and it's going to continue to see the gap widen in that way. And so what I want to say is, if you call yourself a disciple of Jesus Christ in any way, and whatever that means for you, we need to understand that the proclamation of naming Jesus as the Christ, which is kind of what it means in a sense, it doesn't have to do much with modern belief. It has to do much more with that being grasped by the risen Christ. And the way that we talk about that in our tradition, I would even argue that the earliest resurrection traditions, even in the New Testament, are one called the disappearance tradition, where Mark's scene where the empty tomb and the women come and they're scared, and that's how it ends, kind of a cliffhanger. But the other one is that Paul's tradition has this experience tradition, right? He called it an appearance tradition. And much of what when we say yes to Christ, is really, it doesn't have to do much with like modern belief, like the A plus B equals C. I mean, it might have at a certain point have been for you, like the things added up and it made sense, but that doesn't last very long. What lasts is your experience of how Christ and living into the Christ is transforming your existence. And that doesn't have a lot to do with forcing somebody into a belief paradigm. I mean, again, we could have a longer conversation about that, I'm sure, but the invitation is to follow the way. That's the reason we're doing this thing called the Way Collective. The reason, the way that the world will be transformed is through the body of Christ, right? Now, where's Jesus? In us. I mean, that we are. I love that prayer by, I think it's Teresa of Avila. You know, like Christ has no hands but yours. Christ has no feet but yours. Christ has no heart but yours. You know, and so the invitation for us is to live faith out in a different register, to live faith out in a different mode of being. And if we emphasize practicing our faith in a transformative way, it's through relationships that other people will be transformed as well. And in turn, the world will be renewed. And so if that is really the case of what we're doing, then an emphasis on practice and an emphasis on value and affirming experience is not something that has much to do with, I call the opposite 5 C's. Conquest, convert, conform, what is it? Conquest, coerce, convert. Oh, conquest, coerce, convert, conform, and colonize. It doesn't have much to do with that. And if you think about what religion is seen as, especially in America or in the global West, it has, I mean, people associate it a lot with that. And so if we can move to this emphasis on shared value and shared practice, then we don't become vulnerable to the critiques of what you're saying or what you're doing is untrue. It's their experience of whether or not who you are is a person who's at peace, a person who is peacemaking, a person who is loving, a person who is extending compassion to the world. And I just think that is something that has real opportunity to change people's lives. And at the same time, I think that my hope, if you've gotten anything out of what we've talked about today, is that you start to ask questions into that reality. I'm not here trying to tell you how to do it, but what I do know is that I think that the practices and values are an opportunity for however you do it to be very organic to your community. Like the way that we'll do it in the Way Collective and the way that somebody else might name some practices and values that shapes their community might be totally different. And the expression or the model, right, or the software update idea, like that will be organic to your local expression, to what it looks like in IV on a campus here, to what it looks like in the Midwest, right? It's no longer like the church growth strategies of the 90s, right? This is a move toward an embodied faith, an experiential faith that transforms communities. And I look forward to the ways in which the Methodists might embody this, to the ways in which our denomination will embody this, and to the ways in which other expressions will bring a unique and valuable expression of what it means to transform the world today. So thanks for having me. I think, I just want to express my gratitude, but I think we have like just a few minutes if there's any questions or thoughts or reflections that you wanted to ask. We will have a panel a bit later where we'll talk a little bit more together. But if there's anything immediate that you wanted clarification on, now would be the time to ask. Yes?
Would you repeat your 5 good C's?
Oh yeah. Connection, contemplation, critical thinking, creativity, and compassionate action.
I want you to know that we are also recording this presentation with Tim's permission, and so we will put that on our church website for everybody to access.
Let's thank Tim. Do we right if we took a few minute break and then came back together, get some refreshments, come back together, and then Pastor Cindy, the pastor at St. Mark, will share a little bit.
Yes, Alan, let me make this more concrete because I know how these things go. You have about 5 minutes. When you hear us sing a song, that's the cue to come back together, and hopefully you'll join in with us singing "Down in the River to Pray."